I want to talk a little bit about some of the issues that were happening for Native Americans in the West and kind of how some of these conflicts came about. I want to start with a poem written by a man named Hamlin Garland, who wrote a eulogy to the buffalo. So a eulogy is a speech or a poem that you give at a funeral. So kind of keep that in mind. So listen up. Going the wild things of our land, passing the antelope and the buffalo, they have gone with the sunny sweep of untracked plain. They have passed away with the untrammeled currents of our streams. With the falling trees they fell, with the autumn grasses they rotted, and their bones lie white on the flame-charred sod, mixed with the antlers of the elk. For centuries they lay down and rose in peace and calm content. They were fed by the rich grass and watered by sunny streams. The plover called to them out of the shimmering air. The hawk swooped above them. The blackbirds sat on their backs in the still afternoon, and in cool mud they wallowed, rolling in noisy sport. They lived through centuries of struggle in swarming millions till the white man came. The snows of winter were terrible. The dry wind was hard to bear. But the breath of man, the smoke of his gun, were more fatal. They fell by the thousands. They melted away like smoke. Mile by mile they retreated westward. Year by year they moved north and south in dust-brown clouds. Each year they descended upon the plains in endless floods. Each winter they retreated to the hills of the south. Their going was like an ocean current. But each spring they stopped a little short. They were like an ebbing tide. They came at last to meager little bands that never left the hills, crawling in somber flies from canyon to canyon. Now they are gone. So I think that this poem gives us a good job of letting us know sort of the impact that the destruction of the buffalo herds really had on the Native Americans. And really, this is the impetus for everything that's going to happen next. So this map here kind of shows us where some of the battles were taking place of the Indian Wars from 1860 to 1890. So you can see all the little red spots there are battle sites. So there were a lot happening throughout this area. Remember, they are pretty much all fighting against the U.S. military. So that's kind of what we're doing here. And most of these battles are really people trying to kind of hold on to their livelihood. And for a long time, there is some resistance from the Native Americans here. And they put up a pretty big fight. However, the military just kept coming and coming, and the Native Americans were having issues. So they decided that, you know what, it's time to sign some treaties. And one of the treaties deals with an area known as the Black Hills. So the Black Hills, which is what this picture shows here, is a place that is sacred to the Lakota or the Sioux Indians. And basically what they believed, that this is kind of the place where gods walked, right? So to them, it was much like a temple or a church would be, right? And so in the 1860s, 1870s, a series of treaties were signed with the Lakota that basically said, you know what, we're going to keep our hands off. They built this territory. They defined where the reservation was going to be. So if you look at this map here, the gray area is the Great Sioux Reservation. So that's kind of where most of them were living. And the yellow area is what they called unceded Indian territory. So basically that area was seen as hunting ground. That's where the Black Hills were. So it was sacred space. And basically the idea is that the United States is going to keep their hands off of that, right? The Great Sioux Reservation and the unceded territory, that belongs to you, according to this 1868 treaty. The Fort Laramie Treaty is what that's called. And so it seems like, okay, this is great. We're going to give them this land. We're not going to bother them. Everything's hunky-dory. Until gold is discovered in the Black Hills. And as soon as gold is discovered, suddenly all the white men want to go up to the Black Hills. But this has been territory that they were supposed to avoid. This was territory that was granted to the Native Americans. And so obviously this is going to lead to a lot of conflicts. The main two leaders of these conflicts are these three men right here. But the two you really need to know are the first two. So that is Sitting Bull, Chief Sitting Bull, and the second picture is Chief Crazy Horse, or a warrior, not chief, but Crazy Horse. So these are going to be kind of the main resistance against the U.S. military. Now, the military cavalry is led by a guy named General George Armstrong Custer. Now, Custer had served in the Civil War. He was a young man when the Civil War happened and kind of rose rapidly through the ranks, and he was really seen as this American hero. Basically what happens, we're going to see a series of conflicts between Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull and General Custer. Right? So really comes to a head at the Battle of Little Bighorn. So the Battle of Little Bighorn, basically Custer and about 216 men decided that they were going to They had heard that there was going to be kind of like an uprising of sorts and decided they were going to go in and take care of it, right? Unfortunately, they were misinformed. They thought there were only going to be a few hundred Native Americans there. Instead, there were a few thousand. So this is also known as Custer's Last Stand, the Battle of Little Bighorn. And Custer and all of his men are killed in this battle. Now, I want you to take a look here at some of these newspaper articles that came out after the battle. So, extra massacred, General Custer and 261 men the victims. No officer or man left to tell the tale. Down here we have the Indian War, an awful slaughter. General Custer and 300 men killed, the worst Indian battle in years. U.S. troops completely wiped out. On the field of glory, Custer dies like a brave soldier at the head of his column. So clearly, General Custer was meant to be seen as the fallen hero, and the Native Americans were meant to be seen as the savage enemy. So while Custer's Last Stand was a victory at the moment for Native Americans, in the long run, it really means that the military is going to start cracking down on the Native Americans and forcing them into reservations. Now, here's the problem with reservations, okay? So reservations are government supported. So they have facilities. You can kind of see the background here. We've got, they're going to provide a doctor, a store. They'll provide supplies like food and blanket, corn, wheat, that kind of thing. Even supply living, places to live, shelter. But they're willing to do it if you kind of give up some of your native traditions. The supplies that they were getting, not always the best. There are actually stories of blankets that were infected with the smallpox vaccine. There are, stories that like the food was moldy and unfit to eat. Natives were often forced to wear the clothing of white people instead of their native garb, forced to give up their language and their religion. And it became kind of a way of assimilating the Native Americans into American culture. And reservations are still a pretty big deal. They exist all over the United States today. Now, reservations have some pretty special laws that go as a part of them. So today, reservations are federal land, and they are controlled by Native American tribal communities. So it's really kind of a way for them to get their own independence. They're not really subject to state laws if they are federal reservations. So that's a really big deal. And you can see that they're kind of all over the place, right? However, this really doesn't stop the problem. And of course, there is going to be resistance to this, right? So one of the forms of resistance was something called the ghost dance. So the ghost dance was a religious tradition, and the idea behind it, so it was led by this prophet, right? And the idea behind it was if the natives, if the Sioux, if the Lakota do this dance, they can get large numbers of people doing it. the buffalo would return and the white man would disappear, right? Now, if you are a white man, that sounds a little bit like they're going to make you disappear, right? So a lot of people thought that this was a threat. It wasn't necessarily a threat. It was a supernatural kind of belief, but a lot of people saw it as a threat, which meant that people were a little bit more anxious, right? So Sitting Bull, even though he was not the leader of the Ghost Dance movement, was kind of seen, because he was the leader of the Lakota, was kind of seen as this de facto leader. So they went after him. They decided they were going to arrest him. In the process of arresting Sitting Bull, he fights back and is killed. This is going to lead to a lot of tension, right? Because he is the hero of the Lakota. And so everybody's a little bit on edge, right? So they go to an area called Wounded Knee. And basically what they are doing there, so this is a village, a reservation of men, women, children, old, young, all of that. And they decide what they're going to do is confiscate all their weapons, right? Well, at first they claim not to have weapons, but they do some searching and find that, yeah, actually they do have weapons. And in the process of taking some of these weapons, a gun goes off. We don't know if it went off accidentally, if someone actually fired it, but because everybody's on edge, all of a sudden the military is in retaliation mode. And every single person at Wounded Knee was killed. Again, men, women, children, did not matter. Hundreds of Lakota people were killed that day. You can see just the images that were taken afterwards of the burnt villages. You see the burnt teepees in the back, the bodies in the ground, the mass burial sites. I mean, this was a difficult thing. And this really was a turning point for a lot of Native Americans. All of the problems had just started adding up, and many of them basically that had been resisting finally were left to the reservations. So just as an example, we have a guy here named Chief Joseph. So Chief Joseph was the leader of the Nez Perce. So he was leading kind of the resistance of that particular group. So if you look at this picture, you see a man who is, strong and prideful, and he's, got his shoulders back, his head up. This is a man who is definitely proud of his heritage, right? So he is leading a troop throughout the Northwest up there, fighting a general in the area until finally he just can't keep up anymore. So after one final battle in 1877, he surrenders and makes this speech. So I want you to listen to this speech and kind of think about what it sounds like, what he's saying, and what this really means for Chief Joseph here.
I am tired of fighting. Our chiefs are killed. Looking Glass is dead. Tuhulhulsate is dead. The old men are all dead. It is the young men who say yes or no. He who led the young men is dead. It is cold, and we have no blankets. The little children are freezing to death. My people, some of them have run away to the hills and have no blankets, no food. No one knows where they are, perhaps freezing to death. I want to have time to look for my children and see how many of them I can find. Maybe I shall find them among the dead. Hear me, my chiefs. I am tired. My heart is sick and sad. From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever.
So this is a very hopeless speech, right? Think about what he's saying here is, I can't go on anymore, right? I will fight no more forever. The idea, that seems kind of grammatically weird, but think about what it's really saying. He's putting emphasis on the fact that I can't fight anymore. His people are dying, they're suffering, and he's finally given up. And so At this point, a lot of natives are choosing to go to reservations just because they can't keep up the resistance any longer. And Chief Joseph is a great example of that. So compare this picture to the one I showed you first, right? So this picture obviously taken later. This is a man who is defeated, right? First of all, you will notice he's in white people clothes, right? He's been Americanized. But you can see in his eyes that he is not happy, right? His shoulders are hunched over, his head's not held up as high. This is a man who has lost his pride, lost his culture, right? And that's really what was happening. Also, fun fact, the guy sitting next to him is General Howard, the one that defeated him in battle. So what this is going to lead to is a movement known as the Dawes Act movement. So Senator Dawes was obviously a senator in the government, and what he proposed was an act that would take reservation land, and rather than living in as a reservation, they would divide up the land and sell it to individual heads of household, individual families, and they would live on that land and farm it, right? Now, the idea here is to Americanize the native children, the native families, right? So you see this family down here, their hair has been cut, they're wearing more modern clothing. You see the man at the top behind his plow. These people are not farmers, right? This is not something that they have ever done before. So it's completely changing his lifestyle, right? Now, Senator Dawes actually thought he was doing something good for them, right? He wanted to make them citizens. He wanted to kind of bring them into culture. He was known to say, kill the Indian to save the man, right? So when he says kill the Indian, what he means is the Indian culture, not necessarily the man itself. The idea being, if we can make them more American, people will accept them. The problem is that didn't really happen either, right? Another part of this Americanization process is they would take the children from these families and send them to boarding schools on the East Coast. So in places like Philadelphia, which is where one of the biggest schools called the Carlisle School was met. So these children would be sent to these boarding schools, and at these schools, they would be taught skills. They would be taught, how to read and write in English, how to analyze texts and math and science and all of these things. But again, it's also about Americanizing these children, right? So I want you to look at these pictures. So these are pictures of people in their native garb, right? Children before they went to the schools. These pictures are the same children or young adults taken after they'd been at school. So again, same kids, same pictures, completely different people, whether it's their hair, their clothing. You can even see that they have artificially darkened their skin and lightened their skin in these pictures to make them look more white. So one of the things that's really happening here is we are at this time attempting to strip that culture away, making them forget their native language, making them forget their native religion and customs. And so the idea of making them American is really the idea of killing their history, right? And so this is really one of the biggest, issues in American history where American tragedy is taking away the culture of these natives. And there are going to be issues that continue even up until the 20th and 21st century with reservations and what does it mean to be a native? What does it mean to be an American? All of these issues. So this just gives you a little bit of background on some of that stuff. And I hope that you have a good picture of what really was going on. So we'll continue to talk more about this later, but just giving you something to think about here. We'll see you soon. Bye.